Rain hammered the roof of the garden shed when I heard the groan behind the stacked crates. My hand froze on the lock, key half turned, heart suddenly loud in my ears. I told myself it was a cat, or a branch scraping against the tin wall, but the sound came again, low and human, and every instinct in my body told me to run back to the house and pretend I had heard nothing. I did not run. My name is Nora Bellamy, and for 6 years, I have worked as a maid in the Ashcombe estate, cleaning floors that never seem to end, and carrying trays for guests who never look at my face. I am not thin, and I am not elegant, and I learned a long time ago that people like me are easy to overlook. Overlooked people notice things that others miss. That night, I noticed the shed door was not quite shut, though I had locked it myself 2 hours earlier. I pushed it open with the toe of my boot, ready to see nothing at all. Instead, I saw a man slumped against the far wall, one hand pressed hard against his side, dark liquid seeping between his fingers and pooling on the concrete floor. His shirt had once been pale gray. Now it was almost black with blood. His eyes opened the moment the light from my lantern touched him, and even wounded, even bleeding out in a stranger's garden shed, his gaze was sharp enough to cut glass. "Close the door," he said. His voice was rough, but there was no fear in it, only command. I should have screamed. I should have dropped the lantern and run for the main house, waking the entire staff, calling the police, doing any of the sensible things a woman in my position was supposed to do. Instead, I found myself stepping inside and pulling the door shut behind me, because something in his face told me that if I ran, he would either die in that shed by morning, or he would not be there at all, and either way, I would spend the rest of my life wondering who he was, and why he had chosen the one hiding place on the entire property that belonged to someone as invisible as me. "You need a doctor," I whispered, kneeling beside him despite every warning bell ringing in my head. "No doctors." His jaw tightened as he shifted his weight, and a fresh wave of blood darkened his shirt. "No police. No one. You understand me?" "I understand that you'll bleed to death if I don't do something." He almost laughed, though the sound came out as a pained huff of air. "Then do something, girl, since you seem so determined to play nurse." I did not have proper supplies. What I had was a first aid kit, meant for kitchen burns and paper cuts, a few clean rags I kept for polishing silver, and hands that were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the bottle of antiseptic twice before I managed to pour it over the wound. He hissed through his teeth but did not pull away. When I pressed the cloth hard against the gash along his ribs, he grabbed my wrist. Not to stop me, but to steady himself. His grip so tight I knew there would be marks the next morning. "Careful," I murmured, more to myself than to him. "This isn't a proper bandage. It won't hold long." "It will hold long enough." His eyes studied my face in the dim lantern light, and I felt exposed under that gaze in a way I had never felt exposed before. Not by any guest at the estate, not by anyone. "What's your name?" "Nora." "Nora?" He said it slowly, testing the shape of it. "You could have screamed." "I still might." That earned a real smile this time, faint and crooked, though pain pulled at the edges of it. "No, I don't think you will." I finished tying off the makeshift bandage as best I could, wrapping strips of torn cloth around his middle, while he sat perfectly still, watching me work with an intensity that made my hands clumsy. When I was done, I sat back on my heels and studied him properly for the first time. He was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with dark hair damp from the rain, and a face that would have been called handsome if it were not so hard, so controlled, like a man who had trained himself never to show what he truly felt. "You need to leave before morning," I told him. "The head groundskeeper checks this shed every day at 6. "I'm not going anywhere tonight." He leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes briefly, and for a moment, he looked almost human, almost tired, almost like someone who might actually need help rather than demand it. "And you're not telling anyone I'm here." "Excuse me?" His eyes opened again, and the softness I thought I had glimpsed vanished completely. "You heard me. You patched me up. Congratulations. You've made yourself part of this now, whether you like it or not." I didn't ask to be part of anything. Neither did I ask to get shot in a stranger's garden. He shifted again, wincing, and pressed his hand harder against the bandage. But here we are. I stood, brushing dirt from my knees, my mind racing through a dozen possibilities. I could still walk out of that shed and tell Mrs. Whitfield, the head housekeeper, everything I had seen. I could still let the proper authorities handle whatever this man was running from. But something about the way he watched me, calculating, patient, like a man who had already decided how this conversation would end, told me that walking away would not be nearly as simple as it sounded. "Who did this to you?" I asked instead. "Someone who thought I'd be easier to remove than I actually am." He said it lightly, almost amused, but there was steel underneath the words. "Someone I trusted, which was my mistake, not yours." "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting tonight." He studied me again, and this time his gaze lingered on my face longer than necessary, as if he were trying to memorize it. "You saved my life, Nora. Do you understand what that means? It means I did what any decent person would do. It means you're bound to it now." His voice dropped lower, quieter, and somehow that made it more frightening than if he had shouted. "Where I come from, a life saved is a debt owed. You gave me mine back. Now you belong to that debt, until I decide it's settled." I laughed, though it came out shaky and uncertain. "This isn't one of your criminal fairy tales. I don't belong to anyone. I have a job, a room upstairs, a life that has nothing to do with you." "Not anymore." He smiled again, and this time, it did not reach his eyes at all. It was the smile of a man, used to getting exactly what he wanted, wounded or not, bleeding or not. "You owe me a life, Nora Bellamy, and until that debt is paid, you're not going anywhere either." The lantern flickered between us, throwing shadows across his face that made him look, for just a moment, like something far more dangerous than an injured stranger hiding in a garden shed. I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him exactly how wrong he was, that I would call for help the second I stepped out that door, that no wounded man with a smirk and a debt he had invented on the spot could keep me anywhere against my will. But then his hand slipped from his side, and fresh blood welled up beneath the bandage, and the fierce, commanding look on his face cracked just slightly to reveal something rawer underneath. Pain, exhaustion, the fear of a man who knew exactly how close he had come to dying alone in the dark. And despite every warning screaming through my mind, I knelt back down beside him. "Tell me your name," I said. "If I'm going to lie for you, I should at least know who I'm lying for." He studied me for a long moment before answering, as though weighing whether I had earned even that much. "Damien," he said finally. "Damien Cross." The name meant nothing to me then, though it would come to mean everything within days. I helped him shift into a slightly more comfortable position against the wall, propping an old folded tarp behind his back, and I told myself this was a temporary arrangement, a single night of foolish kindness that would end the moment the sun rose and sense returned to me. I did not know yet that Damien Cross was not a man who dealt in temporary arrangements. I did not know that the debt he spoke of was not a metaphor, not a threat meant to frighten a frightened maid into silence, but a rule he lived by absolutely. The same rule that had likely kept him alive through worse nights than this one. I only knew that his grip on my wrist had loosened, that his breathing had steadied slightly, and that somewhere outside the storm was beginning to ease. "Get some rest," I told him, gathering the bloodied rags to dispose of before anyone found them. "I'll check on you before dawn." "Nora?" His voice stopped me at the door, quieter now, almost gentle in a way that unsettled me more than his earlier commands had. "Thank you." I did not answer. I slipped out into the thinning rain and made my way back toward the house, my mind spinning with everything that had just happened, and everything I suspected was still to come. I told myself I would sleep for a few hours, wake before the groundskeeper's rounds, and find some way to move Damien Cross somewhere safer, somewhere that had nothing to do with me or my quiet, careful life. I did not sleep at all that night. Instead, I lay staring at the ceiling of my small attic room, replaying his voice in my head, the certainty in it, the way he had said my name like he already knew he would be saying it many more times before this was over. I thought about the estate's owners, the Ashcombs, sleeping peacefully 2 floors below, entirely unaware that a wounded stranger with cold eyes and a dangerous smile was hiding in their garden shed because of me. By the time gray light began creeping through my small window, I had made my decision. I would help him through the next day, find him proper medical care through channels no one could trace back to either of us, and then I would insist, firmly and finally, that whatever debt he believed existed between us was paid in full. I was not going to become part of whatever world had left him bleeding on my shed floor. I had my own life, small as it was, and I intended to keep it exactly as it had always been. I dressed quickly, tied my apron with hands that still trembled slightly, and made my way down to the kitchens before the rest of the staff woke, my mind already working through excuses for the extra bread and bandages I would need to smuggle outside. I told myself it was one more day, one more act of kindness, and then this strange chapter would close as quickly as it had opened. I had no way of knowing that Damian Cross had already decided otherwise, and that men like him rarely allowed anyone else to write the ending to their stories. The bread I stole from the kitchen that morning felt heavier than it should have, as if guilt had a weight all its own. I wrapped 2 rolls and a small jar of honey inside a cloth napkin and tucked them beneath my apron, moving through the corridors with the practiced quiet of someone who had spent years making herself invisible. No one questioned a plump maid carrying cleaning supplies toward the garden shed before sunrise. That was the strange gift of being overlooked. People saw the uniform, not the woman wearing it. Damian was awake when I slipped inside, sitting up straighter than he had any right to after the night he'd had. The bandage had held, though barely, and dried blood crusted along the edges of the cloth. His eyes tracked me the moment the door opened, alert in a way that told me he had not slept either. "You came back," he said, and there was something almost like surprise in his voice, quickly buried beneath his usual composure. "I told you I would." I knelt beside him and unwrapped the bread, setting it within his reach. "Eat. You lost a lot of blood." He took the roll but did not eat immediately, watching me instead as I checked the bandage, gently peeling back the edge to inspect the wound beneath. It looked angry, red at the edges, but not infected, not yet. Whatever training had taught him to survive nights like this had also taught him how to stay alive long enough for a stranger's clumsy first aid to matter. "You should have gone to the police," he said finally, biting into the bread. "Reported an intruder. Let them deal with me. Would that have been safer for me?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment, the mask of easy command slipped just enough to show me something colder underneath. "No, it would not have been safer for you at all. Then I suppose I made the right choice. Or the most foolish one." He studied me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Most people run from men like me, Nora. They don't bandage our wounds and bring us breakfast. Most people haven't found a bleeding stranger in their garden shed." I sat back, wiping my hands on a rag. "What happens now? You can't stay here forever. Someone will find you. I need 3 days. Maybe 4. He said it simply, as though stating a fact rather than a demand. "Enough time for my people to locate me and arrange safe transport. Until then, I stay hidden, and you make sure no one finds this shed interesting enough to look inside. And if I refuse?" The question hung in the air between us, and for a long moment, he said nothing, simply watching me with those sharp, calculating eyes. Then he smiled, slow and deliberate, the same smile from the night before that promised he had already considered every possible answer I might give. "You won't refuse," he said, "because you already know what happens to people who owe debts they don't pay. That's not fair. Fair has very little to do with survival." He leaned his head back against the wall, some of the tension leaving his shoulders now that food and rest had steadied him slightly. "Besides, I think you're more curious about me than frightened of me. Otherwise you would have run the moment you saw me." I opened my mouth to deny it, then closed it again, because some small, treacherous part of me knew he was right. There was something magnetic about him, something that pulled at my attention, even as every rational thought screamed at me to walk away and never look back. I had spent 6 years being the quiet, forgettable maid in a house full of people who barely acknowledged my existence. And here was a man who looked at me like I mattered, even if the reason he looked at me that way had everything to do with the debt he claimed I owed him. "Who is Marcus?" I asked suddenly, remembering a name he had muttered in his sleep sometime before dawn, when the pain had pulled fevered mumbling from him, despite his best efforts to stay silent. His expression shuddered immediately, the openness from moments before vanishing like a door slamming shut. "Where did you hear that name?" "You said it in your sleep, along with several things that sounded like threats." Marcus is my second in command, my most trusted man. He said it carefully, each word measured. If he doesn't already know I'm missing, he will soon. And when he finds me, things will move quickly. Is he the one who did this to you? No, the single word carried an edge sharp enough to cut. The one who did this to me is someone I trusted even more than Marcus. Someone who should never have had the opportunity to betray me, and yet found it easily enough. I wanted to ask more, wanted to understand exactly what kind of world I had stumbled into the edges of, but something in his face told me I had reached the limit of what he intended to share for now. Instead, I busied myself with practical matters, explaining the estate's daily schedule, so he would know when it was safe to move, when the groundskeeper made his rounds, when the kitchen staff took their breaks, when the family retired for the evening. "You've thought this through," he observed, watching me sketch a rough map of the property on the back of an old seed packet. "I've worked here 6 years. I know every routine this house has, down to the minute." I handed him the sketch. "If you're going to hide successfully, you need to understand the rhythm of this place better than the people who live in it." He studied the map with genuine interest, and for the first time since I had found him bleeding on the shed floor, I saw something that looked like respect flicker across his features. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone easier to intimidate into silence." He set the sketch aside. "Someone who would have panicked, or fled, or tried to use my condition against me somehow. Instead, I find a woman calmly mapping out an entire estate to help hide me more effectively." "Don't mistake practicality for loyalty," I warned him. "I'm helping you survive because I couldn't live with myself if I let a man die in front of me. That doesn't mean I trust you, or that I believe a word of this debt you keep insisting exists." "You'll believe it eventually." His voice was quiet, certain. "Everyone does, once they understand how the world I come from actually works." 2 days passed in careful, quiet rhythm. I brought him food twice daily, changed his bandages, and reported on the small movements of the household that might affect his hiding place. Mrs. Whitfield grew suspicious of my frequent trips to the garden, commenting once that I seemed unusually invested in the shed's upkeep lately. I offered a lie about pest problems among the stored bulbs, and she accepted it without further question, though I noticed her watching me a beat longer than usual afterward. Damien's strength returned gradually. By the 3rd day he could stand without wincing, could walk the length of the shed without needing to brace himself against the wall. His color improved, and with it, the sharp, commanding presence that illness had temporarily dulled returned in full force. He asked me questions about my life, my family, why a woman with clear intelligence and resourcefulness had spent 6 years scrubbing floors for people who barely noticed her. "My mother worked here before me," I told him one evening, sitting across from him as the last light faded outside. "When she passed, I took her position because it was steady, and steady mattered more to me than ambition. I don't need excitement, Damien. I need a roof and a paycheck, and a life that doesn't fall apart. And yet, here you are, harboring a wanted man in a garden shed." He tilted his head, studying me with something almost like amusement. "That doesn't sound very steady to me." "This is temporary. 4 days, you said. Then you'll be gone, and my life goes back to exactly what it was before." "Does it?" His voice dropped, quieter, more serious than the teasing tone from moments before. "Do you really believe you can go back to exactly what you were, after everything you've seen?" I did not have an answer for that, because some part of me already suspected he was right, that something fundamental had shifted the moment I chose to hide him rather than report him, and that shift could not simply be undone by his departure. On the 4th night, everything changed. I had just finished my evening rounds through the house, checking that all the doors were properly locked, when I noticed headlights sweeping across the driveway, far too late for any expected visitor. My stomach tightened immediately. I hurried to the window overlooking the garden and watched 3 black vehicles roll to a stop near the estate's outer gate, their engines cutting off in unison, doors opening to release figures who moved with the disciplined precision of men used to danger. I did not wait to see more. I slipped out through the servants' entrance and ran across the wet grass toward the shed, my heart hammering against my ribs, terrified that whoever these men were, they had come to finish what the attack on Damien had started. He was already standing when I burst through the door, tension radiating from every line of his body, one hand pressed against the wall for support, the other reaching instinctively for a weapon that was not there. "They're here," I gasped. 3 cars, at least 6 men. For a moment, fear flickered across his face, raw and unguarded, before the mask of control slammed back into place. Then, astonishingly, something like relief broke through instead. 6 men, he repeated, moving toward the small window at the back of the shed to peer out at the approaching figures. Moving in formation, not scattering to search. "That's not an attack, Nora. That's an escort." "How can you be certain?" "Because I recognize the way they walk." A slow smile spread across his face, the first genuine one I had seen from him since the night I found him bleeding. "That's Marcus. My people found me." Relief should have flooded through me at those words, the promise that this strange, dangerous chapter of my life was finally closing, that Damien would leave with his men, and my quiet existence would resume exactly as it had been before. Instead, I felt something closer to dread settle into my chest, because I understood, with sudden and unwelcome clarity, that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine far more than simply whether Damien Cross survived the night. It would determine whether I was allowed to simply walk away, or whether the debt he insisted I owed him was about to become far more permanent than either of us had anticipated. "Stay behind me," Damien said, straightening to his full height, despite the wound still healing beneath his shirt. The transformation was immediate and startling. Gone was the wounded man who had leaned on my shoulder for support only hours earlier. In his place stood someone entirely different, someone whose voice carried the weight of absolute authority even through a whisper. I did as he asked, though every instinct told me to run in the opposite direction, back toward the house, back toward the safety of a life where strange men in black vehicles had no business appearing in the middle of the night. But curiosity, or perhaps something deeper than curiosity, kept my feet rooted to the spot. The shed door opened without a knock. A tall man with graying temples and eyes that missed nothing stepped inside first, scanning the small space in the span of a single breath, before his gaze landed on Damien, and something in his shoulders finally relaxed. "You're alive," the man said, and though his voice remained steady, I caught the faint tremor of relief underneath it. "Barely," Damien replied. "Report, Marcus." So this was Marcus. The name Damien had murmured in his fevered sleep now had a face attached to it, weathered and serious, the face of a man who had clearly spent years standing exactly where he stood now, ready to receive orders and act on them without hesitation. "Vittorio moved fast after the attack," Marcus said, his eyes flicking briefly toward me before returning to his boss. "He's already telling the families you're dead, claiming the territory as his own. We've been searching for you for 4 days, running down every lead, checking every hospital and morgue within 200 miles. And you found me because of a woman with a first aid kit and more courage than sense," Damien said, and though his tone carried its usual dry edge, there was something almost warm beneath it when his eyes flicked toward me. Marcus studied me properly for the first time, his gaze thorough and assessing in a way that made me acutely aware of my plain uniform, my work-roughened hands, the flour still dusting the hem of my apron from the morning's baking. Whatever he saw did not seem to disappoint him. "She patched the wound herself?" he asked. "Better than most field medics I've employed," Damien said. "Kept me hidden, kept me fed, and mapped this entire estate so I'd know exactly how to avoid detection. All without asking for anything in return." "I did ask for something," I interjected, unable to stay silent any longer, despite the danger radiating from every person in that small shed. "I asked him to leave, once he was strong enough. That debt he keeps mentioning, whatever it means to people like you, I never wanted it." Marcus glanced at Damien with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between amusement and warning. "She doesn't know how this works." "She's about to learn," Damien said quietly. My stomach dropped at the certainty in his voice, the casual way he spoke about my future, as though it were already decided, already written into whatever code governed his world. I wanted to argue, to remind him again that I had never asked for any of this, that saving a stranger's life should not become a life sentence of obligation, but the look on his face told me arguing would accomplish nothing tonight. "We need to move," Marcus said, glancing toward the door. "Vittorio has people watching every road within 50 miles. The longer we stay in one place, the more exposed we become. Damien nodded, then turned to me with an expression that mixed genuine gratitude with something harder underneath. Get your things. Excuse me? You heard me. He took a step closer, close enough that I could see the exhaustion still lingering beneath his renewed composure, close enough that his voice dropped to something meant only for me. Vittorio will have eyes on this estate within hours, if he doesn't already. The moment he learns a maid hid me and helped me survive, your life here becomes a liability, not a safety. I'm not leaving you behind to become his next target. This is my home, my job. I can't just disappear. You can, and you will, at least until this situation with Vittorio is resolved. His eyes held mine, steady and unyielding. I told you that you belonged to this debt, until I decided it was settled. That hasn't changed. If anything, tonight only proves how right I was to say it. Marcus cleared his throat, glancing between us with poorly concealed curiosity. The cars are waiting, boss. I looked toward the shed door, toward the dark shapes of the vehicles idling beyond it, toward a night that had somehow transformed from a single act of kindness into something far larger and far more frightening than I could have imagined 4 days earlier. Every rational part of me screamed to refuse, to insist on staying, to remind Damien Cross that I had a life here that mattered to me, however small it might seem to men who moved through the world with private armies and enemies plotting their deaths. But another part of me, quieter and more honest, understood that Damien was not entirely wrong. If men like Vittorio discovered what I had done, discovered that I had hidden their target and helped him heal, my quiet, ordinary life would end, regardless of what I chose tonight. The only question was whether I faced that danger alone, or with the protection of the very man whose survival had put me in danger in the first place. Give me 10 minutes, I finally said, my voice steadier than I felt. I need to gather what little I have. Damien's expression did not soften exactly, but something in it eased, as though he had genuinely expected more resistance and was quietly relieved not to face it. Marcus will go with you. Stay close to him. I nodded, and as I turned to leave the shed with Marcus falling into step beside me, I could not shake the feeling that I was crossing a threshold from which there would be no simple return, that whatever life waited for me beyond the Ashcombe Estate's gates would be entirely unlike the careful, invisible existence I had built for myself over 6 long years. The house I had lived in for 6 years looked different in the dark, smaller somehow, as though it already understood it was no longer my home. I moved through my small attic room quickly, stuffing a single bag with the few possessions that mattered to me, a photograph of my mother, a worn blue shawl she had knitted before she passed, a handful of coins I had saved from years of modest wages. Marcus waited outside my door, silent and watchful, his presence a constant reminder that whatever normal life I had known was already slipping away. I left a note for Mrs. Whitfield, vague enough to avoid suspicion, claiming a family emergency required my immediate departure. It was a lie, but a necessary one, and as I set it on the kitchen table where she would find it in the morning, I felt something close to grief settle over me. 6 years of steady, quiet routine, gone in the span of a single night, all because I had chosen not to walk past a bleeding stranger. The car ride that followed passed in tense silence. I sat in the back seat beside Damien, who had changed into a clean shirt one of his men provided, the fresh bandage beneath it hidden from view. Marcus drove, his eyes constantly flicking to the mirrors, checking for followers with the practiced vigilance of a man who took nothing for granted. The remaining vehicles trailed behind us, forming a protective convoy through roads I did not recognize, deeper into countryside I had never had reason to visit. "Where are we going?" I finally asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. "Somewhere safe," Damien answered, though the vagueness of it did nothing to ease my nerves. "A property outside the city, far from anywhere Vittorio would think to look. You'll be protected there while things are sorted out." "And how long will that take?" His jaw tightened slightly, the only sign that the question troubled him more than he wanted to admit. "As long as it takes to deal with a man who tried to have me killed and is currently telling half the underworld that he succeeded." I studied his profile in the dim light filtering through the car window, trying to reconcile the composed, dangerous man beside me with the wounded stranger who had gripped my wrist in the dark 4 nights earlier. Both versions of him existed simultaneously, I realized. The vulnerability and the authority, woven together in ways that made him impossible to categorize simply as villain or victim. "Tell me about him," I said. "Vittorio, who is he to you?" Damien was quiet for a long moment, watching the dark countryside slide past the window before answering. "My cousin, my father's brother's son. We grew up together, learned this business together, and for most of my life I trusted him more than almost anyone else in my organization." "What changed?" "Ambition changed," he said simply. "He decided he deserved what I had built, decided that blood alone should not determine who leads and who follows. When my father passed control to me, instead of splitting it between us, Vittorio smiled at my coronation and waited 5 years to make his move. 5 years is a long time to wait. Patience is not usually associated with betrayal, but Vittorio has always understood that the best opportunities require careful preparation." Damien's voice carried a bitterness he did not bother to hide. "He waited until he had turned enough of my people against me, until he had built alliances I never suspected, and then he struck at the one moment I was most vulnerable, during a supposedly routine meeting that turned into an ambush. How did you escape?" "Barely, and only because I know that estate's grounds, as well as I know my own hands. I ran until I could run no further, and I collapsed in the first hiding place I found." He glanced at me then, something unreadable flickering across his features. I did not expect that hiding place to include someone willing to save me. The car eventually turned down a long gravel drive, headlights sweeping across an imposing stone house, surrounded by high walls and dense trees. The kind of property built specifically for privacy and defense, rather than comfort. Armed men patrolled the perimeter, nodding to Marcus as we passed through an iron gate that closed automatically behind us. Inside, the house was elegant but cold, all dark wood and heavy furniture, a place that had clearly seen more strategy sessions than family gatherings. A woman named Elena, sharp-eyed and efficient, showed me to a room on the second floor, explaining in clipped tones that meals were served at set times and that I was not to leave the house without an escort under any circumstances. "Am I a guest here, or a prisoner?" I asked her directly, tired of navigating half-truths and careful evasions. Elena studied me for a moment before answering. "You're someone Damien Cross has decided is worth protecting. In this house, that distinction matters more than whatever title you want to give it." I did not sleep well that first night in the unfamiliar room, my mind cycling through everything that had happened, everything that might still happen, and the strange, unsettling realization that some part of me was more curious than afraid about the world I had stumbled into. The following morning, Damien found me in the small garden behind the house, staring at flowers I did not recognize, still adjusting to the strangeness of my new surroundings. "You look like you're plotting an escape," he observed, settling onto the bench beside me with the careful movements of a man still healing. "I'm plotting how to survive whatever this is, actually," I replied, "which feels different from an escape, though perhaps it shouldn't." Wise distinction. He studied the garden for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Vittorio believes I'm dead. That gives us time to plan, but not much of it. Once he consolidates enough support among the families, proving I'm alive will only provoke him to try again, more carefully this time. So what's your plan?" "Expose him before he can fully claim what he's stolen. Show the families the truth, that their new leader betrayed blood in the worst possible way, and that loyalty built on lies rarely survives close examination." He turned to look at me directly. "I need people who can move through spaces without being noticed, who can gather information without raising suspicion. People exactly like you." My stomach twisted with sudden understanding. "You want me to spy for you?" "I want you to help me survive, in whatever way makes the most sense given your particular skills." He said it plainly, without apology. "You noticed a shed door was unlocked when it should have been locked. You mapped an entire estate's routines in a single afternoon. You lied convincingly to your own housekeeper, without hesitation. Those are not small talents, Nora. They're survival instincts, not weapons to be used against dangerous men." "In my world, they're the same thing." His voice softened slightly, though the intensity behind it remained. "I'm not asking you to fight anyone. I'm asking you to help me see clearly, to notice things my own people might overlook, because they're too close to the situation. In exchange, I ensure your protection until this is resolved, and I consider whatever debt you believe I'm forcing upon you paid in full." The offer hung between us, more reasonable than I expected from a man who had spent days insisting I owed him something unbreakable. I studied his face, searching for manipulation, for the calculated smile that had first frightened me in the shed, but found instead something closer to genuine appeal, a man asking for help rather than demanding it. And if I refuse to help at all, if I simply want to wait this out quietly until it's safe to return to my own life, then you wait it out quietly, and I ensure you're protected regardless. He held my gaze steadily. I'm not the monster my reputation suggests, Nora. Whatever you might have assumed when you first found me bleeding on your floor, I don't force loyalty from people who have already given me more than I had any right to expect. Over the following days, I found myself drawn deeper into the rhythms of Damien's household despite my initial resistance, observing conversations between his lieutenants, noticing tensions I might have missed if I had not spent years learning to read the subtle currents beneath polite surfaces. I began to understand the shape of his organization, the careful balance of loyalty and fear that held it together, and the specific vulnerabilities Vittorio's betrayal had exposed. One evening, sharing a quiet dinner with Damien in a room too large for just the two of us, I mentioned a detail I had noticed almost by accident, a supplier named Owen, who visited the house twice that week, under circumstances that seemed unnecessarily secretive for routine business. Owen handles logistics for our northern operations, Damien said, though something in his expression sharpened at my observation. What exactly did you notice? He left both times through the servants' entrance, rather than the front door, and both times he met privately with Marcus, rather than with you directly, despite your recovery being well enough now for regular business. Damien set down his fork slowly, his expression turning thoughtful in a way that made me realize I had stumbled onto something significant. Marcus has been handling more decisions independently since the attack, given my need to remain hidden. That's reasonable, given the circumstances. Is it reasonable that he's making those decisions without informing you of the details? The silence that followed stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, and I watched something shift behind Damien's eyes, a suspicion taking root that had clearly not existed before my careless observation. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost its usual warmth entirely, replaced by the cold, calculating tone I imagined he used when addressing genuine threats to his organization. You may have just noticed something considerably more important than either of us realized, he said quietly. I need you to keep watching, Nora, carefully, and without drawing attention to what you're doing. I nodded, though a chill settled over me at the implications of what we were both now considering. The possibility that Vittorio's betrayal might not have been an isolated act of ambition, but rather the first visible crack in a conspiracy that ran far deeper than either of us had initially understood, potentially reaching into the very heart of the small circle Damien trusted most. The following days passed with a tension I could feel humming beneath the surface of every conversation in that house. Damien grew quieter, more watchful, though he took care never to let his suspicions show openly around Marcus, who continued moving through the household with the same easy confidence he always carried. I found myself watching him too, studying the small details that might reveal whether my instincts had been correct, or whether I had simply imagined significance where none existed. Elena, the sharp-eyed woman who managed the household staff, became an unexpected source of information, though she never seemed to realize how much she revealed simply by discussing the ordinary business of running such a large property. Over shared cups of tea in the kitchen, she mentioned in passing that Marcus had requested access to certain financial records, usually reserved for Damien's direct review, citing the need to manage operations during his recovery. She also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that 2 of the household guards had been quietly reassigned the week before the attack on Damien, moved to a northern property under Marcus's authorization rather than Damien's. Is that unusual? I asked carefully, keeping my tone light and curious rather than pointed. A little, Elena admitted, stirring sugar into her tea. Mr. Cross usually handles guard assignments personally. He's particular about who watches over this house, but he was recovering from a fever that week, or so we were told, so I suppose Marcus simply stepped in to handle what needed handling. A fever, not the truth of what had actually happened, but a cover story convincing enough that even the household staff believed it. I filed the detail away carefully, understanding that if Marcus had been the one crafting that particular lie, he had done so with remarkable foresight, well before the actual attack occurred. That evening, I found an opportunity to share what I had learned with Damien privately, meeting him in the same garden where he had first asked for my help. He listened without interrupting, his expression darkening steadily as I laid out each piece of information. 2 guards reassigned the week before the attack, he repeated slowly, as though testing the weight of the words. Financial records requested under the pretense of managing my recovery. A fever story crafted before I was ever actually shot. It could still be coincidence, I offered, though even as I said it, I did not quite believe my own words. Marcus does not deal in coincidence. Damien's voice had gone flat, controlled in a way that frightened me more than open anger would have. He plans. He anticipates. It's precisely why I trusted him as completely as I did, because he never left anything to chance. What will you do? Nothing, yet. He turned to look at me, and something in his gaze had shifted, grown heavier with the weight of a betrayal he had not wanted to consider. If Marcus is working with Vittorio, or worse, if he orchestrated this entire situation himself, and simply used Vittorio as the visible face of the attack, then acting too quickly will only warn him that his plan has been discovered. I need proof before I act, Nora, and I need you to keep watching, without ever letting him suspect you've noticed anything at all. The weight of that responsibility settled heavily on my shoulders as the days continued to pass. I threw myself into the role Damien had asked me to play, positioning myself where conversations naturally occurred, offering to help Elena with household tasks that placed me near Marcus and his closest associates, without appearing to seek out their company deliberately. It was exhausting work, this constant performance of casual disinterest, while every sense remained alert for details that might confirm or deny our growing suspicions. I began noticing patterns in Marcus's communications, the way certain calls pulled him away from the house at unusual hours, the careful way he angled his phone screen whenever anyone approached while he read messages. I noticed too that Owen, the logistics supplier who had visited so secretively, returned a 3rd time, and this visit ended with Marcus escorting him personally to a car waiting well beyond the property's main gate, rather than the usual vehicle that collected regular business visitors. I reported each observation to Damien in careful, quiet conversations, held only when we were certain of privacy, and with each new piece of information, I watched him grow more convinced that the betrayal ran deeper than a single cousin's ambition. Vittorio may have been the visible face of the attack against him, the name whispered through the underworld as the new power rising to claim territory. But Marcus's fingerprints were everywhere in the details, patient and calculated in exactly the way Damien had once praised as his greatest strength. I trusted him with everything, Damien admitted one night, his voice carrying an exhaustion that had nothing to do with his healing wound. My life, my organization, decisions that could have destroyed everything I built if he'd chosen to betray that trust at any point over the past decade. And now I'm forced to wonder whether every piece of advice he ever gave me was designed to serve my interests, or his own. You can't know for certain yet, I reminded him gently. We have suspicions, patterns, things that look suspicious when examined closely. That's not the same as proof. No, it isn't. He rubbed a hand across his face, weariness evident in every line of his posture. Which is why I need you to find the proof, Nora. Something undeniable. Something that would convince even the families most loyal to Marcus that he's been working against me all along. The pressure of that request settled into my chest like a stone, heavy and constant, following me through every quiet moment in that increasingly tense household. I understood now, with a clarity I had not possessed when I first bandaged Damien's wound in the dark of that garden shed, that I had become something more than a maid hiding a wounded stranger. I had become a piece in a much larger game, one where the stakes involved not just my own safety, but the survival of an entire organization, built on loyalty that was proving far more fragile than anyone had realized. That night, I lay awake in my unfamiliar room, replaying every interaction I had witnessed between Marcus and the household staff, searching for patterns I might have missed, for signs that the man Damien trusted most completely might be exactly the kind of threat neither of us had thought to guard against. The debt Damien insisted I owed him had brought me into a world of danger I never asked for, but it had also given me a role, a purpose beyond simply surviving. And despite my fear, some quiet, stubborn part of me had already decided I would see this through to its conclusion, whatever that conclusion turned out to be. The proof came from a place I never expected. Tucked inside a ledger Elena asked me to help organize during what she called a routine inventory of household expenses. Marcus had left it carelessly in a study he rarely used, and as I sorted through pages of mundane figures, I noticed a series of payments routed through an account labeled only with initials, transfers timed precisely to match the week before the attack on Damien. My hands trembled as I photographed the pages using a small camera Damien had given me for exactly this purpose, capturing dates, amounts, and account numbers that meant nothing to me directly, but would mean everything once placed in front of someone who understood how to trace such things. I returned the ledger to its exact position, before Marcus could notice its absence, my heart pounding so loudly, I feared the sound alone might betray me. I found Damien in his study that evening, and the moment he examined the photographs on my small camera's screen, his expression transformed into something I had not yet seen from him, cold fury barely restrained beneath a surface of absolute stillness. "These are payments to Vittorio's known associates," he said quietly, scrolling through the images with fingers that had gone rigid with tension. "Dated 2 weeks before the attack. Marcus wasn't simply careless in the aftermath, Nora. He financed the very people who tried to kill me. What happens now? Now I confirm this through channels Marcus cannot trace back to us, and then I decide how to handle a betrayal this significant without triggering a war within my own organization before I'm ready to fight one." He set the camera down carefully, as though the device itself had become something dangerous. "You've done something remarkable, Nora, something my most trusted people failed to notice for weeks." Before I could respond, a sharp knock interrupted us, and Elena entered, looking pale and shaken, explaining that Marcus had requested my presence in the kitchen regarding a supply matter. My stomach dropped immediately. The request too specific, too unusual for a woman who had spent days deliberately avoiding drawing his attention. "Don't go," Damien said immediately, his voice sharp with sudden alarm. "If I refuse, he'll know something is wrong." I forced steadiness into my voice despite the fear tightening my chest. "I'll be careful." I should have listened to the warning in Damien's eyes. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, 2 men I did not recognize seized my arms before I could react, one clamping a firm hand over my mouth, while the other bound my wrists with practiced efficiency. Marcus stood near the back door, watching the entire scene unfold with an expression of quiet satisfaction that turned my blood to ice. "You've been very busy lately," he said calmly, stepping closer as I struggled uselessly against the men holding me. "Photographing ledgers that don't concern you, asking Elena questions about guard assignments and financial records. Did you really believe I wouldn't notice a maid suddenly developing such convenient curiosity?" I said nothing, unable to speak past the hand still covering my mouth, my mind racing through every possibility, even as fear threatened to overwhelm rational thought entirely. "Damien trusts you," Marcus continued, circling me slowly, "which is precisely why you've become such a useful tool for drawing him out of hiding. He'll come looking the moment he realizes you're missing, and this time, I'll make certain there's no garden shed nearby for you to save him in." They moved me quickly through a servant's passage I had not known existed, out into a waiting vehicle that sped away from the property before I could gather my bearings enough to memorize the route. I was taken to an abandoned warehouse somewhere I did not recognize, bound to a chair in a room lit by a single bare bulb, left alone for what felt like hours while my mind cycled desperately through every scrap of information I had gathered about Marcus, searching for anything useful, anything that might buy me time or leverage. When Marcus finally returned, he removed the gag from my mouth with almost gentle care, an unsettling contrast to the danger radiating from every other part of his demeanor. "You're more valuable to me alive and cooperative," he explained, settling into a chair across from me. "Damien will trade nearly anything to secure your safe return. Territory, information, perhaps even his own surrender, if I present the offer correctly. He won't surrender anything to a man who tried to kill him," I said, forcing steadiness into my voice despite my racing pulse. "You've miscalculated if you believe loyalty like his bends that easily." "Loyalty?" Marcus repeated, something bitter twisting his expression. I gave that man over a decade of loyalty, built his organization alongside him, protected him from threats he never even knew existed. And when his father died, he inherited everything simply because of blood, while I remained a subordinate, despite doing far more of the actual work that kept this organization thriving. So you decided betrayal was a fair trade for ambition. I decided I deserved what circumstance denied me. His eyes hardened. Vittorio wanted power. I wanted recognition. Our interests aligned conveniently enough that cooperation made sense for both of us. I studied him carefully, searching for any weakness in his composure, any detail I might use to my advantage. Does Vittorio know you're the one who actually planned the attack, or does he still believe this was entirely his own achievement? Something flickered across Marcus's face, brief but unmistakable, confirming a suspicion I had barely dared to form. Vittorio believes what serves my purposes for him to believe. So he doesn't know, I pressed, understanding suddenly the shape of an opportunity I might be able to exploit. You've been using him exactly the way you're now trying to use me, as a tool to accomplish what you want without ever taking the risk yourself. That's enough, Marcus said sharply, standing abruptly, though the tightness in his jaw told me my words had found their target. Does it bother you, I continued, pressing forward despite the danger of doing so, that even in your own plan, you're still second in command? Still someone else's tool, just wearing a different master's name? He struck me then, a sharp backhand that snapped my head sideways and left my ears ringing, though I forced myself not to cry out, understanding instinctively that showing weakness now would only strengthen his position rather than mine. When I looked back at him, blood welling at the corner of my mouth, I saw genuine anger in his eyes, the controlled mask finally cracking under pressure I had deliberately applied. You know nothing about my plans, he snarled. I know enough to understand you're afraid, I said quietly. Afraid that even if this works, you'll never actually be the one in charge. Vittorio will claim the territory, and you'll simply have traded one master for another. Marcus said nothing further, turning abruptly and striding from the room, leaving me alone once more with my throbbing jaw and racing thoughts. I understood I had bought myself time, perhaps only minutes, but every minute mattered if it gave Damien's people opportunity to locate this warehouse before Marcus could complete whatever plan he intended. I worked at the ropes binding my wrists, twisting and pulling despite the pain it caused, desperate to free myself before Marcus returned with whatever decision my provocation had forced him toward. The bindings loosened slightly, enough that hope flickered alongside the fear still coursing through me, and I redoubled my efforts, ignoring the raw burn against my skin. Outside, I heard raised voices, then the unmistakable sound of vehicles arriving in rapid succession, tires screeching against concrete, doors slamming open in quick, coordinated sequence. My heart leapt with sudden hope, even as fear warned me the sounds could mean anything: rescue or further danger, allies or enemies I had not yet encountered. The door to my small room burst open, and Damien filled the doorway, his expression a storm of fury and desperate relief, as his eyes found me bound to the chair, blood still drying at the corner of my mouth. Nora. He crossed the room in 3 swift strides, kneeling to work at the ropes with hands that trembled slightly, despite his obvious effort to remain composed. I told you not to go into that kitchen. I know, I managed, my voice rough. But I found out something important while I was here. Marcus is the one who planned everything, not Vittorio. Vittorio doesn't even know the full truth of what Marcus has done. Damien's hands stilled briefly against the ropes, absorbing the weight of that information, even as he continued working to free me. That changes everything. If Vittorio believes he orchestrated this alone, he'll never suspect Marcus is positioning himself to seize control the moment Vittorio's own position weakens. Exactly. The ropes finally loosened enough for me to pull my wrists free, and I rubbed at the raw skin gratefully. If we can get that information to Vittorio, to prove Marcus has been using him exactly the way he plans to eventually betray him too, it might fracture whatever alliance currently exists between them. Something like admiration flickered across Damien's face despite the tension still gripping his expression. You did all of this while tied to a chair. I had incentive, I said, managing a shaky attempt at humor despite everything. Marcus's voice suddenly cut through the tense quiet, cold and controlled once more, as he stood in the doorway, with several armed men flanking him. How touching. But I'm afraid this reunion is premature. Damien rose slowly, positioning himself protectively between me and the doorway, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. It's over, Marcus. I know everything. The payments, the guard reassignments, the plan to use Vittorio, and then discard him once he's served his purpose. Knowing something and surviving long enough to act on it are very different accomplishments, Marcus replied, though I noticed a flicker of uncertainty crack through his composure for the first time since I had watched him orchestrate my capture. You're still outnumbered, Damien, still recovering from wounds that haven't fully healed. This doesn't have to end badly for either of us if you're reasonable. Reasonable, Damien repeated, something dangerous entering his voice. You tried to have me killed, kidnapped an innocent woman to draw me into a trap, and you expect reasonable to still be an option available to you? The standoff stretched taut between them, every person in that room understanding that whatever happened in the next few moments would determine far more than simply who survived the confrontation. I remained still behind Damien, my mind already working through the information I still possessed, the leverage I had gained through Marcus's own careless anger, searching for any way to tip this dangerous balance toward an outcome that kept us both alive. Your men are already outside, Marcus said, though the confidence in his voice had thinned considerably. Surrounded, the moment they stepped through that door. You should have brought an army, Damien, not a handful of loyal men and a wounded side you can barely defend. I brought exactly what I needed, Damien replied evenly, because unlike you, I still have men who trust me completely, who followed me here without hesitation the moment they learned where you'd taken Nora. I watched the armed men flanking Marcus exchange uncertain glances, small cracks appearing in a loyalty that had never been tested this directly before. Whatever stories Marcus had told them to justify tonight's actions, doubt now flickered visibly across more than one face. He's been lying to all of you, I said suddenly, stepping slightly out from behind Damien, despite the way his hand shot back to hold me in place. Marcus didn't just help Vittorio plan the attack on Damien, he's already planning to betray Vittorio too, the moment it becomes convenient. Ask him yourselves. Ask him what happens to any of you once he no longer needs your loyalty. She's lying, Marcus snapped, though the sharpness in his voice betrayed how deeply my words had landed among the men he needed most in that moment. Am I? I held his gaze steadily despite my racing heart. Tell them about the payments to Vittorio's associates, arranged 2 weeks before the attack ever happened. Tell them how carefully you've positioned yourself to seize control, the moment Vittorio's grip weakens enough to make it possible. One of the armed men lowered his weapon slightly, uncertainty replacing the hard resolve he had carried into the room. Marcus noticed the shift immediately, his expression tightening with barely controlled fury. Enough, he snarled, raising his own weapon toward Damien with sudden, decisive motion. If loyalty won't hold you in line, fear will do the job just as effectively. Everything happened quickly after that. Damien moved with a speed that belied his still-healing wound, closing the distance between himself and Marcus before the other man could fully level his aim. I heard shouting, the scramble of bodies colliding, the sharp crack of a single shot fired into the ceiling as the struggle knocked Marcus's weapon skyward. Damien's men surged forward from positions I had not even realized they occupied, overwhelming Marcus's remaining loyalists within moments, the brief chaos resolving faster than my racing heart could fully process. When the dust settled, Marcus knelt on the floor, restrained by 2 of Damien's men, his composure finally shattered entirely, replaced by raw, undisguised hatred, as he stared up at the man he had spent months betraying. This isn't finished, he spat. It is for you, Damien replied, his voice cold and absolutely certain. Whatever happens next, whatever conversation I have with Vittorio, once he learns the truth about your role in all of this, your part in this organization ends tonight. I stood trembling slightly in the aftermath, the adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation beginning to fade, leaving raw exhaustion and lingering fear in its place. Damien turned to me immediately, his expression softening from the cold authority he had just displayed into something warmer, more personal. Are you hurt? He asked, his hands gentle, as he examined the bruise forming along my jaw where Marcus had struck me. I'll survive, I said, managing a weak smile despite everything. Though I think I've had enough excitement to last several lifetimes. We're not finished yet, Damien said quietly. though his hand lingered against my face a moment longer than strictly necessary. Vittorio still believes he's won. Marcus's betrayal changes the entire landscape of this conflict, but only if we use that information correctly, and quickly, before he has time to consolidate his position any further. I nodded, understanding that whatever relief I felt at surviving tonight's ordeal would have to wait, that the true confrontation, the one that would determine whether Damien reclaimed everything Vittorio had stolen from him, still lay ahead of us both. 3 days after Marcus's betrayal was fully exposed, Damien called together the leaders of every family still loyal enough to answer his summons, gathering them in a grand hall within the same stone house where I had first begun to understand the true scope of his world. I stood near the back of that room, dressed in clothes Elena had provided, simple but elegant, watching men and women who commanded respect and fear in equal measure settle into their seats, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. Vittorio arrived last, flanked by his own guards, his confidence radiating through every deliberate step as he crossed the hall toward the seat reserved for him near the front. He was younger than I expected, sharp-featured and handsome, in a way that made his betrayal feel even more calculated. A man who had clearly spent years cultivating an image of trustworthy charm to mask ambitions he had kept carefully hidden. "Cousin," he said, addressing Damien with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I confess, learning you survived was quite the surprise. The families were told you'd been lost in an unfortunate incident." "An incident you orchestrated," Damien replied evenly, standing at the front of the hall with the composed authority I had come to recognize as entirely genuine, not merely performed for effect. "Though I understand now that even your own role in that incident was more limited than you likely believed." Vittorio's smile flickered slightly, the first crack in his careful composure. "I'm not certain what you mean." "Then allow me to clarify." Damien gestured, and one of his men brought forward the ledger I had photographed weeks earlier, along with printed copies of the images distributed among the gathered families. Marcus financed the very associates who carried out the attack against me, timed precisely 2 weeks before it occurred. He did this while continuing to serve as my most trusted advisor, feeding you information and resources, while simultaneously positioning himself to seize control the moment your own position weakened enough to make it convenient. A murmur swept through the gathered families as papers passed from hand to hand, confusion and calculation visible on multiple faces as they absorbed the implications of what Damien had just revealed. Vittorio's expression had gone rigid, his eyes darting briefly toward the door where Marcus, restrained and silent, stood flanked by 2 guards. "This is fabrication," Vittorio said, though his voice carried less conviction than the accusation demanded. "Marcus has always been loyal to me." "Has he?" Damien's voice remained calm, though steel underscored every word. "Ask him yourself, cousin. Ask him what role he intended for you once you'd served your purpose in removing me from power." All eyes turned toward Marcus, whose expression had settled into something bitter and resigned, a man who understood that whatever outcome awaited him tonight, denial would accomplish nothing at this point. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the commanding authority I remembered from our confrontation in that warehouse, only a hollow, defeated honesty. "I planned everything," he said simply. "Vittorio provided the ambition and the willingness to act, but every detail, every payment, every arrangement that made the attack possible came from me. And yes, cousin," he added, looking directly at Vittorio with something almost like contempt, "I intended to remove you as well, once you'd served your purpose, and eliminated the one obstacle standing between me and the position I'd earned through a decade of loyal service that was never properly recognized." The hall erupted into overlapping voices, family leaders turning to confer urgently among themselves, as the full scope of Marcus's betrayal settled over the gathering. Vittorio's face had drained of color, the realization dawning visibly that he had been nothing more than a tool in a scheme far larger than his own ambitions, a pawn positioned to take the risks, while Marcus waited patiently to claim the ultimate prize. "You used me," Vittorio said quietly, his earlier confidence completely shattered. "I used what was available," Marcus replied without apology. "You wanted power badly enough to betray blood. I simply understood how to direct that hunger toward an outcome that ultimately served my own interests." I watched from my position near the back of the hall, as the careful alliance between the two conspirators unraveled entirely, Vittorio's expression cycling through disbelief, humiliation, and finally, a cold, calculating anger, directed now toward Marcus rather than Damien. Whatever bond ambition had temporarily created between them dissolved completely under the weight of Marcus's casual admission, leaving Vittorio isolated and exposed before the very families he had hoped to lead. "The question before us now," Damien said, raising his voice to command the room's attention once more, "is what justice looks like for two men who conspired against not only me, but against the stability of every family gathered in this hall tonight." Vittorio acted from misguided ambition, believing he deserved a position circumstance denied him. Marcus acted from calculated betrayal, using that ambition as a weapon, while planning his own rise to power all along. The families deliberated for what felt like hours, voices rising and falling as arguments were made and countered, alliances tested and reformed in real time, as everyone present recalculated where their own loyalties should properly rest, given this new understanding of events. I remained quiet throughout, watching Damien navigate the complex politics of his world, with a skill that made clear exactly why he had commanded such respect before Marcus's betrayal had threatened to unravel everything. Eventually, a decision emerged from the gathered families, one that stripped both Vittorio and Marcus of any position or protection within the organization, exiling them from territories and alliances that had once been theirs to command. It was not the swift, violent justice I might have expected from a world governed by such dangerous men, but something more calculated, a punishment that left both conspirators alive but utterly powerless, their ambitions permanently crushed beneath the weight of their own betrayal. As the hall slowly emptied, family leaders departing with expressions that suggested newfound respect for the man who had survived betrayal from two directions, and emerged with his position not merely intact, but strengthened by his careful, patient handling of an impossible situation, Damien finally approached me where I still stood near the back of the room. "You did this," he said quietly, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that made my pulse quicken despite everything we had just witnessed. Every piece of evidence that exposed Marcus, every crack in the alliance between him and Vittorio, all of it traces back to a maid who chose to bandage a stranger's wounds instead of running for help. "I only noticed what was already there," I said, though warmth spread through my chest at the genuine gratitude in his voice. "You could have found the same information eventually, with or without my help. Perhaps. But you found it in time to prevent Marcus from completing whatever plan he still intended, and you did it, while enduring danger no one should have asked you to face." His hand found mine, gentle, despite the authority I had watched him wield only moments earlier. "The debt I spoke of that first night, the one you never wanted to owe me, I think we both understand now that it was settled long before tonight." "Then I suppose this is where we say goodbye," I said, though something in my chest tightened uncomfortably at the thought, a reluctance I had not expected to feel, given everything this strange, dangerous world had cost me. "Is that what you want?" Damien asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of the commanding authority that governed his interactions with everyone else in that hall. "To return to the Ashcombe estate? To scrubbing floors and carrying trays for people who barely acknowledge your presence?" I considered the question honestly, weighing the quiet, steady life I had built for myself over 6 years, against the frightening, exhilarating uncertainty of everything I had experienced since the night I found him bleeding in that shed. The woman who had first hidden Damien Cross out of simple human decency had changed considerably over these past weeks, discovering reserves of courage and sharp intelligence she had never had reason to test in her careful, invisible existence. "I don't know what I want," I admitted honestly. 6 years ago, steady and unnoticed felt like enough. But I'm not certain that woman exists anymore, not after everything I've seen and done since that storm. "Then perhaps you don't have to decide immediately." Damien's thumb traced gently across my knuckles, a small gesture that carried more warmth than any of his earlier declarations about debts and obligations. "Stay, not because you owe me anything, not because some code demands it, but because I find myself considerably more interested in your continued presence than I ever expected to be, given how this began." "That sounds dangerously close to affection, Damien Cross," I said, managing a small smile despite the emotion tightening my throat. "Perhaps it is. His own smile matched mine, softer than the calculated smirk I remembered from our first meeting, genuine in a way that transformed his entire face. I've spent my life surrounded by people who feared me, who followed my orders out of obligation or self-interest. You're the first person who challenged me, who saw past the reputation to whatever remained underneath, and who helped me, not because you had to, but because some part of you couldn't walk away from someone who needed you. I thought of my small attic room at the Ashcombe estate, of Mrs. Whitfield's careful suspicion, of 6 years spent perfecting the art of being overlooked by people who never truly saw me at all. I thought of the fear that had gripped me that first night in the shed, and how it had transformed, slowly and unexpectedly, into something that felt remarkably like purpose, like finally mattering to someone, in a way that had nothing to do with the quality of my cleaning or the silence of my presence. If I stay, I said carefully, it won't be as someone hiding in shadows, doing quiet work while you make all the decisions. I want a real place here, Damien. Not a debt paid, not an obligation fulfilled, but something I choose freely. That, Damien said, lifting my hand to press a gentle kiss against my knuckles, is precisely what I'm offering. Not a maid forced to stay, but a partner I choose to keep, standing beside me rather than behind me, for as long as you're willing to remain. In the days following that tense gathering, I found myself adjusting to a strange new rhythm within the household, one where Elena no longer treated me as a guest requiring careful management, but as someone whose opinion carried genuine weight in the daily operations of the estate. She sought me out one afternoon in the garden, her usual brisk efficiency softened slightly by something that looked almost like respect. "You handled yourself well in that hall," she said, settling onto the bench beside me. "I've watched powerful men crumble under far less pressure than what Marcus subjected you to." I was terrified, I admitted. I still don't entirely understand how I managed to keep speaking instead of simply falling apart. Fear and courage aren't opposites, whatever people believe. Elena studied the garden thoughtfully. The bravest people I've known were always afraid. They simply refused to let that fear make their decisions for them. Her words stayed with me over the following weeks, as I settled more fully into a life I could never have imagined during my 6 quiet years at the Ashcombe estate. Damien insisted on formally introducing me to the remaining allied families, a process that felt overwhelming at first. Dozens of powerful, suspicious people studying me, with expressions that ranged from curiosity to open skepticism about what role a former maid could possibly play within their carefully ordered world. One evening, a family leader named Julian Ashworth approached me directly during a formal dinner, his expression carrying the particular sharpness of a man testing whether I deserved the position I now occupied at Damien's side. "Forgive my bluntness," he said, "but many of us are curious what qualifies a maid to advise a man like Damien Cross on matters of this magnitude." "Nothing qualifies me except attention," I replied honestly, refusing to shrink from the challenge in his tone. I spent 6 years learning to notice details other people overlooked, because noticing was the only power available to someone in my position. That skill uncovered a conspiracy that nearly destroyed this entire organization. I'd say that qualifies me well enough. Julian studied me for a long moment, before something like genuine respect flickered across his weathered features. "Perhaps it does at that," he said, raising his glass slightly in something that resembled a toast, before returning to his own table. Damien, who had been listening from nearby, caught my eye across the room with an expression of quiet pride that warmed me more than any formal declaration could have managed. Later that night, as the gathering wound down and guests began departing into the cool evening air, he found me alone on the terrace, overlooking grounds that had begun, slowly and surprisingly, to feel something like home. "Julian doesn't offer respect easily," he said, joining me at the railing. "You've made an impression tonight." "I'm still learning how all of this works," I admitted. "The politics, the careful balance of power and loyalty that seems to govern every conversation in this world. Sometimes I feel like I'm performing a role rather than living a genuine life." "That feeling fades," Damien said, though his voice carried understanding rather than dismissal. "I felt it too, when my father first began preparing me for leadership. Eventually the performance and the person become difficult to separate, though I hope you'll always retain whatever honesty first drew me to trust you in that shed." "I hope so too." I looked out over the darkened grounds, thinking of the woman I had been before that storm, quiet and careful, and entirely unremarkable to anyone who passed her in the estate's long hallways. Sometimes I barely recognize the person I've become these past weeks. I recognize her perfectly, Damien said quietly. She's the same woman who chose kindness over safety that first night, who mapped an entire estate to protect a stranger, who endured Marcus's cruelty without breaking, and who exposed a conspiracy that would have destroyed everything I built. The circumstances changed, Nora, but the courage was always there, waiting for a situation that finally demanded it. His words settled something unsettled within me, a validation I had not realized I needed until he offered it so simply and directly. We stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the last of the departing guests make their way down the long driveway, before Damien spoke again, his voice carrying a seriousness that drew my full attention. "I want to make something clear," he said. "Whatever role you choose to occupy here, whether as an advisor, a partner, or something else entirely that we haven't yet defined, it should be entirely your choice. I've spent this entire ordeal insisting you owed me something, using language of debt and obligation, because that's the framework I understood best. But you've more than repaid whatever debt existed between us. Anything that continues from this point forward exists because you choose it freely, not because you feel bound by circumstance." "And if I choose to stay?" I asked. "What exactly would that mean, beyond attending dinners and impressing skeptical family leaders?" Damien turned to face me fully, his expression more open and unguarded than I had seen since that first night in the shed. "It would mean building something together. This organization needs restructuring after Marcus's betrayal exposed vulnerabilities I never knew existed. It needs someone with your particular gift for noticing what others overlook, working alongside me, rather than simply advising from a careful distance. And personally," he added, his voice softening further, "it would mean continuing whatever this has become between us, without the complicated language of debts and obligations clouding what I actually feel." "Which is?" I pressed, genuinely curious despite the vulnerability evident in his expression. "Which is considerably more than gratitude for saving my life," he admitted, "though I suspect you already understood that, given everything we've survived together these past weeks." Weeks later, when the last remnants of Marcus and Vittorio's conspiracy had been fully dismantled, and the families had settled into a new equilibrium under Damien's confirmed leadership, I stood beside him at a gathering meant to formally introduce the woman who had helped expose the greatest threat his organization had faced in a generation. I was no longer the overlooked maid who cleaned floors at the Ashcombe estate, invisible to everyone who passed her in quiet hallways. I was Nora Bellamy, standing as an equal beside a man who had once smirked and told me I owed him a life, only to discover that the life he truly wanted was one built alongside mine, freely given rather than forcibly claimed. The storm that had brought us together had long since passed, but what remained in its aftermath was something neither of us had expected that first frightening night. A partnership forged not from debt or obligation, but from courage, honesty, and the unlikely recognition that even the most overlooked among us might hold exactly the strength needed to change everything.